Hi, this is Congressman Tom Cole. This is another one of our congressional weekly chats. We're back in Washington, D.C. this week for serious work after a 3-week break where all of us had the opportunity to rework our districts and get reacquainted with our constituents again. This has actually been a pretty consequential week in a number of ways. Let me start off with what I think is maybe the most important development of the week. President Biden announced that all American troops would be withdrawn from Afghanistan by September 11th of this year. That's a big decision. It's also a huge risk. The Taliban still controls over half of Afghanistan. It's on the offensive. And if you take out the American troops, you also end up taking out 7,000 additional NATO troops that are there in a supporting role. The risk is that the terrorists will retake Kabul, reestablish control over the country, and Afghanistan will once again, as it was before 9/11, be used as a terrorist platform, launching attacks against Americans throughout the region and, frankly, directly here. That's the start of course, 9/11 and the tragedy that we had in New York and Washington, D.C. So it's not a move that I support. We've been able to thwart the terrorists with a pretty modest force, less than 3,500 troops in Afghanistan, and again, supported by an additional 7,000 NATO troops. So it's a big risk. And if Kabul collapses, being the capital city, then we could have serious problems. The president also gave us a first peek at his budget. He hasn't submitted a full budget, but what I've seen of the budget, it's called the skinny budget, it's just the broad outlines, is disturbing. It does exactly what you think it would do. First of all, it increases domestic spending by 16%. These are liberal social programs for the most part. Some of them are good. There's additional money for the National Institute of Health, the Center for Disease Control. Those are things I support and I think are wise investments. But we're spending too much. At the same time, when we live in a very dangerous world, where we see the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians becoming ever more assertive, we effectively cut defense. There's a minor increase, less than inflation, about 1.2%. And underneath the top line, we move a lot of money that's now going for military readiness to things like climate control studies. It's just not the right way to go. We need to be increasing the defense budget, according to our own defense experts, by somewhere between 3 and 5% a year over the next several years to maintain our military edge against China and Russia. So again, it's just the budget overall just strikes the wrong balance. Way too much spending at home on things we don't need, not enough spending on our defense in an era when we do need to look after that. We've also seen surface some crazy ideas in Washington, D.C. this week. Two senior members of Congress, one in the Senate, one in the House, filed a bill to actually increase the size of the Supreme Court from 9 justices to 13. The idea being we're going to change a 6-3 conservative-leaning majority into a 7-6 liberal majority. That's court packing. That's real court packing. The Supreme Court has had 9 justices for 150 years. It is true, Congress has the authority to change the number of justices, but the late Justice Ginsburg, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, thought 9 was the right number. Justice Byers, who's one of the most liberal members of the court, recently issued a lecture and a statement where he said he thought 9 was the right number, and this sort of thing would undermine confidence in the court. If every time one side gets the majority, they change the number of justices, then you won't get continuity in the court, and you'll get tremendous distrust for it. So it's a really bad idea. So far, Speaker Pelosi has said she won't bring it to the floor, but she does support a presidential commission that President Biden appointed that's looking at this as one of the options for quote-unquote reforming the court. When you hear liberals talk about reforming the court, you can rest assured they mean taking the court over. So I think this is something that we're going to have to keep an eye on going forward. I think one of the only reasons that legislation isn't going to come to the House in the short term is they simply don't have the votes right now to pass it. Even some of my Democratic colleagues find this a really disturbing development, and I think would not vote for it in the end. But again, you never know. Now, finally, we continue to see extremely liberal legislation passed through the House on very narrow majorities. And we continue to have discussion about the so-called infrastructure bill that the president laid out, which frankly has very little in the way of real infrastructure. You can look at it different ways, less than 5% for roads and bridges. There's some other infrastructure things in there, ports, airways, broadband, that I think probably go up to 20, maybe 25% of the whole bill. The rest of it is simply liberal spending. Elder care for $400 billion, more money for climate change studies, $150 billion for electric vehicles, which the private market is already working on itself, and frankly, no effort to make sure that those new electric vehicles actually pay the road tax in the way that people that drive gas and diesel power vehicles do today. So I expect us to continue to be intensely engaged, and for this to be a very partisan and polarized period of time in the House of Representatives. But we'll continue to try and work through on the budget priorities. We need to fund the government before the end of September of this year. That's the normal appropriations process. We really do need an infrastructure bill, and there will be a counter proposal, probably instead of $2.25 trillion, in the $600 to $800 billion range from the Republicans. It'll be traditional infrastructure, hopefully with a mechanism to pay for it. And we'll move on. But right now, Washington, again, is very seriously engaged. I think Democrats overreaching and trying to get bigger things done on very slim majorities than either they can achieve or good for the country. But again, we're engaged again. We look forward to your input going forward, and we'll be back next week with another chat.